During the Revolutionary War, the government ran using the Articles of Confederation. And as we've seen, there were problems with that. But after the war, the problems didn't get better. In fact, in some ways, they got worse. We now were left with a war-torn economy and massive amounts of debt to France, who had really helped us win the war. But the government had no power to levy taxes, which meant they couldn't actually collect money to repay that debt. They could try things like issuing bonds, but that wasn't a particularly effective way to revitalize the economy and to pay off war debt. There were trade barriers. While the national government under the Articles could negotiate with foreign countries, so could each state, which meant that negotiations were really complicated. Because if, say, France or Britain, who still had major interests in this region, wanted to negotiate with the 13 states and with the American national government, who would they negotiate with? And how would these negotiations work? Would they negotiate with each state separately with the national government? Would then states recognize any national agreements? Would the national agreement recognize state agreements? It became very complex. And actually, European powers started just closing off trade with the American government because of that. In addition to that, states could print their own money. So even though we had a national currency, each state could make their own currency, which led to quite a bit of chaos. Think about it. If you live outside of New York State, let's say you live over the bridge or tunnel in New Jersey, and you come into Baruch sometime for class, not this class, but a class, and you want to buy a Starbucks. I know a couple of you said on the on your introductions that you like Starbucks. One of my guilty pleasures too, certainly. So come to campus, you want a Starbucks. Well, you have New Jersey money because that's where you live. So you go to pay them in New Jersey dollars. But Starbucks is like, no, we're in New York. We want New York dollars. So you have to exchange your New Jersey dollars for New York dollars. But that means you have to deal with an exchange rate, and that exchange rate varied wildly. Now, New York had a pretty major port, which meant that we could do a lot of trade, whereas New Jersey didn't have a major of a port system at the time, which meant they weren't doing as much international trade or interstate trade between states, right? Which made their currency less valuable than New York currency. So New York might set the exchange rate really high. And that became an issue, right? If you don't know what exactly your exchange rate is going to be every time you come to campus and want to buy a coffee, that's going to be real chaotic for you, right? It's going to make it really hard to just sort of exist if you constantly are exchanging money back and forth just on a day-to-day basis. And if states like New York, which had ports, could set up their monetary systems and trade barriers with other states, preventing potentially other states from developing their economies accordingly. Now, on top of all this, there was no national army or peacekeeping power, which meant that internal rebellions like Shays Rebellion couldn't be put down. And significantly, we couldn't defend ourselves against external invasion. Now, remember that at this time, France, Britain, and Spain all had significant interests in the region, which meant that they might think, hey, these new colonies are really in debt and they're kind of fighting amongst each other economically. And, oh, they have no army. Let's invade and get this valuable land. So it meant that we really couldn't defend ourselves if that were to happen. So these Articles of Confederation, this sort of early constitution, so to speak, needed to be revised or just scrapped altogether and replaced. And we're going to see how that happened when we look at the Constitution.